To understand the winter of 1978, one must first remember the autumn that preceded it. It was a season of profound deception. Across the British Isles, September and October had arrived with a warmth that was almost unnatural, one of the mildest autumns on record. People lingered in parks, the golden leaves falling onto sun-warmed pavements, while the evening air carried a gentle, balmy promise that winter might be kind this year. But beneath this golden veneer, the very foundations of British society were beginning to fracture. While the weather was mild, the political and economic climate was reaching a boiling point. Inflation was a silent thief, gnawing away at the wages of the working class, rendering the government's proposed 5% pay cap not just an insult, but a death sentence for the British household budget. The first tremors of the coming earthquake didn't come from the sky, but from the factory floors. In September, workers at Ford took a stand, walking out in a massive strike that eventually secured them a 17% raise. It was the spark in a powder keg. Across the nation, in every union hall and staff room, the question was the same. If them, why not us? By the time the Christmas lights were strung across Oxford Street, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy industrial resentment. The country was a taut wire, waiting for a snap. And then, on December 30th, the atmosphere provided the final, crushing blow. The mild Atlantic air was unceremoniously shoved aside by a predatory, freezing front surging directly from the heart of Siberia. As the sun set on 1978, the transition was violent. Rain, which had been falling steadily, suddenly crystallized into a blinding horizontal snow. Heathrow Airport recorded a daytime high of -3 degrees, a temperature that felt like a physical assault. By New Year's Eve, the Britain that woke up was unrecognizable. The streets were disappearing under a shroud of white that felt less like a holiday decoration and more like a burial cloth. For a nation already reeling from industrial unrest, the arrival of the most brutal winter in 16 years felt like a divine punishment. The government and the unions were locked in a cold, bitter standoff. And as the mercury plummeted, the British public realized, with a chill of terror, that they were trapped between a frost they couldn't control and a social collapse they couldn't stop. As January 1979 dawned, the British Isles were no longer a sovereign nation. They had become a province of the Arctic. The cold was not merely a weather condition, it was a physical wall that had been erected around every town and village. In the southwest, the counties of Devon and Somerset, usually the emerald jewels of the English countryside, were buried under snowdrifts that reached a staggering 6 feet in height. In some remote corners, snowbanks surged to 8 meters, swallowing entire roads and hedgerows. The town of Ilfracombe became an island in a sea of white, its only link to the outside world being the rhythmic, desperate thrum of rescue helicopters. On the A20 between Dover and Folkestone, the scene was one of post-apocalyptic silence. Hundreds of cars sat abandoned, buried to their bonnets in frozen drifts. A line of metal ghosts stretching into the grey horizon. Under normal circumstances, Britain would have fought back. The machinery of the state, the gritters, the salt spreaders, the maintenance crews would have worked through the night to reclaim the roads. But the winter of 1979 was not normal. The men who operated the gritters were on strike, locked in a bitter dispute with local councils over pay and dignity. The salt bins remained locked, and the yellow trucks sat idle in their depots, gathering dust while the country gathered ice. This was the true terror of the winter of discontent, the realization that the very people we relied on to keep the world moving had decided to stop. The snow stayed because the hands that usually cleared it were folded in protest. By mid-January, the cold reached a lethal crescendo. On January 13th, the village of Braemar in Scotland recorded a temperature of -24.6 degrees Celsius. It was the third lowest temperature ever recorded in British history. At this level of cold, physics begins to change. Breath freezes into a crystalline cloud the moment it leaves the lips. To step outside was to invite a physical stinging that felt like 1,000 needles. Inside British homes, the battle for survival was equally grim. Pipes, laid deep within Victorian brickwork, groaned and shattered by the thousands. Water froze solid in the mains, leaving families with no running water and no way to flush toilets or wash clothes. Central heating, then a luxury for many, struggled and failed as the fuel ran dry. Most homes still relied on the flickering warmth of a coal fire, but the coal lorries were no longer coming. People woke up to find thick, intricate patterns of frost on the inside of their windows. Not the delicate lace of a Christmas card, but heavy slabs of ice that had to be scraped away just to see the grey, hopeless daylight outside. As the frost deepened in late January 1979, the crisis moved from the frozen roads into the very sanctuary of the human soul. It was no longer just about the cold or the darkness. It was about the fundamental dignity we owe to the departed. In the industrial heartlands of Liverpool and Tameside, the unthinkable happened. 56 gravediggers, men who performed the most solemn and physically demanding task in society, decided they had reached their breaking point. For years, they had laboured in the mud and slime, crawling into collapsing trenches for wages that barely kept their own families fed. On January 22nd, they laid down their shovels. It was the first strike of its kind in British history, and its timing was nothing short of catastrophic. As the winter flew and the bitter cold took their inevitable toll on the elderly and the vulnerable, the bodies began to pile up. With the gates of the cemeteries locked, the machinery of mourning ground to a shuddering halt. Funeral directors, usually the most composed of professionals, found themselves in a state of growing panic. Their chapels were full, their back rooms were overflowing. The Liverpool City Council was forced into a decision that would haunt the nation's conscience for decades. They rented a vast hollow electronics factory in Speke, a cold, industrial shell, and repurposed it as a temporary morgue. Inside, nearly 150 corpses lay on the cold concrete floor, sealed in heavy-duty plastic bags and covered with preserving crystals. Every day, 25 more arrived, delivered in the back of vans through the swirling snow. The psychological weight on the grieving families was unbearable. Imagine the trauma of losing a loved one only to be told that their final resting place was a warehouse on an industrial estate. Because of the pickets at the cemetery gates, funeral services had to be moved to distant churches, and families were forced to drive past the very ground where their ancestors lay, knowing their loved ones were stored like cargo in a factory nearby. The British press, sensing the visceral horror of the situation, ran headlines that felt like scenes from a Gothic novel. There was talk of burials at sea or mass graves, hypotheticals mentioned by medical officers that sent the public into a frenzy of distress. It felt as if the very structure of society was liquefying in the frost. When a nation can no longer bury its dead with honour, the line between civilization and chaos becomes dangerously thin. The gravediggers eventually secured a 14% raise after a fortnight, and the burials resumed in a frantic, sombre rush. But the image of those silent, plastic-wrapped figures in a Liverpool warehouse remained, a permanent scar on the psyche of a nation that felt it had lost its way. By late January, the visual landscape of Britain's great cities had undergone a grotesque transformation. The pristine white of the fallen snow was no longer the dominant colour. It had been replaced by the dull, oily sheen of black plastic. On January 22nd, the nation's refuse collectors, the bin men, walked off the job, joining the growing ranks of the strikers. Almost overnight, the rhythmic clatter of bin lorries vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence and an ever-growing stench. In London's West End, Westminster City Council made a decision born of both desperation and political theatre. They designated Leicester Square, the very heart of Britain's cinema and tourist district, as a temporary dumping ground. Mountains of rubbish began to rise, reaching 6 feet in height, encroaching upon the statues of Shakespeare and Chaplin. These were not just piles of waste, they were rotting monuments to a failed social contract. As the snow continued to fall, it covered the trash in a thin, deceptive layer of white, but beneath the crust, the organic matter fermented in the cold. The rats, emboldened by the abundance of food and the lack of human interference, multiplied with terrifying speed. Commuters in their overcoats would hurry past, shielding their noses, as the grey shadows of rodents darted between the bags in broad daylight. The heart of the empire had become a festering wasteland, and the imagery captured by the world's press was devastating. Britain looked less like a modern European power and more like a medieval city in the grip of a plague. Amidst this urban decay, the political leadership of the country appeared dangerously detached. Prime Minister James Callaghan, returning from a summit in the sun-drenched Caribbean, stepped off his plane at a freezing Heathrow airport and committed the ultimate political sin. When asked by reporters about the mounting chaos and the suffering of the public, he attempted to downplay the severity of the situation. Though he never uttered the exact words, "Crisis. What crisis?" The sentiment was captured perfectly by the Sun newspaper's infamous headline the following morning. To a public that was shivering in unheated homes, walking past mountains of rotting trash and unable to bury their dead, the Prime Minister's apparent indifference was a spark in a powder keg. Perception in politics is reality. And the reality for the British public was that their leaders were basking in the sun while the country was being eaten alive by frost and filth. The strikes spread like a contagion to ambulance drivers, to hospital porters, and to lorry drivers, until the very arteries of the nation's supply chain were severed, leaving supermarket shelves empty and fresh food rotting in the fields. February 1979 arrived not with a whimper, but with a final, brutal roar. Fresh blizzards swept across the country between the 14th and 16th, bringing heavy snow, easterly gales, and temperatures of -3 degrees Celsius, with winds gusting up to 50 miles per hour. Roads cracked open, potholes formed overnight, and in a terrifying storm surge along the south coast, cars were ripped from seafront car parks and swallowed by the ferocious waves. And yet, through this final onslaught, the strikes continued. The nation was utterly exhausted, its patience worn to a frayed thread. It was not until February 14th that a fragile agreement was finally hammered out between the government and union leaders, bringing the industrial action to a gradual, weary close. When the true thaw finally arrived in mid-February, it was greeted not with relief, but with a palpable sense of emotional and physical depletion. Water dripped incessantly from rooftops, the sound a mournful accompaniment to the emerging landscape. Roads slowly reappeared from beneath the ice, revealing a pockmarked, scarred surface. The first unfrozen milk delivery, a simple act of commerce, was met with cheers in some villages, a testament to how basic necessities had become luxuries. Life, slowly and cautiously, began to return to something resembling normal, but the fragile trust between the public and its institutions was irrevocably broken. Nearly 30 million working days had been lost, the economy was in tatters, and Britain's image on the global stage had been profoundly, humiliatingly tarnished. The consequences were swift and seismic. That May, Britain went to the polls. The Labour government, widely blamed for losing control of the country and failing to navigate the twin crises of winter and industrial unrest, suffered a crushing defeat. James Callaghan, the Prime Minister, whose perceived detachment had cost him so dearly, saw his government fall. And from the ashes of the winter of discontent rose a figure who would change Britain forever. Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party, sweeping to power in a landslide victory. Her mandate was clear: to rein in the unions, to dismantle the power structures that had crippled the country, and to restore order. The laws she introduced in the aftermath, stricter strike rules, mandatory ballots, fundamentally altered the balance of power, ushering in an era of profound social and economic change. The winter of 1978-79 was more than just a season. It was an epoch. It wasn't merely the cold that left its mark on those who lived through it, but the chilling feeling that everything was falling apart, the mountains of rubbish, the silent warehouses of the unburied dead, the frozen, desolate streets. Yet, amidst the despair, there were also glimmers of profound humanity. The neighbours who checked on each other, the strangers who helped dig out cars, the quiet resilience in pubs where people huddled by the fire, sharing stories and laughter that pushed back against the encroaching chill. In the end, Britain did get through it. The snow melted, the strikes ended, and life moved on. But the winter of discontent remained, a stark, unforgettable lesson in the delicate balance between human will and the unforgiving forces of nature and society, forever marking the end of one era and the tumultuous dawn of another.